All right, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back. I apologize if you hear some background noise, some kids playing outside. Nothing I can do about that, so I apologize. So today we're going to be talking about Shia Islam for the love of the Prophet's family and loyalty to the Imams of his house. So first off, I'd like to say thank you to the Ghamidi Center for allowing me to teach this course. I don't think this kind of course would be allowed in many places, and I think it shows their intellectual openness that I can teach this course. I don't have to have my materials reviewed or anything like that, so I really appreciate that. On that note, please do consider a small donation. All right, so let's get started. Some disclaimers. I come from a Sunni background, and my experience, my research experience is limited to, my expertise is limited to Sunniism. I can, however, try to present a fair representation of Shia Islam. Even still, I recommend you to go straight to the source or the sources, because biases and subjectivities are inevitable and unavoidable. So I do recommend you going to certain scholars or experts on the topic of Shia Islam. I do not believe in Zakir Naik style, quote unquote, interfaith dialogue or debates. I believe education and scholarship is always situated in a certain context and has a purpose. I cannot simply ignore the fact that Shias are being persecuted all over the Sunni world, part of which is based on a demonization of their beliefs. So I'm not claiming to, exist in some sort of neutral, objective space where nothing is going on in the world. Clearly, there are events going on, and the things we talk about have an effect in the world out there. Even though I will express my points of departure, I do not see Shiism as somehow wholly other. I consider it a part of our greater Islamic tradition, which is vast and rich. I contend further that we might find in it something positive, instructive, and useful. And near the end of this talk, I will hope to point to some of those things. Now, I'm sure you've heard all this before, quote, I am just a Muslim. I am neither Sunni nor Shia, just Muslim. I think it's well-intentioned, and it's okay to say this from a confessional standpoint. But I think it's problematic from an academic perspective. Like I say, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, then it's a duck, whether you call it a duck or not. And then the other thing is, does this sort of statement silence the religious other, i.e. Shias? Think about it this way. If you're Pakistani, I think you will relate to this. If an Indian person, especially if they were Hindu, said to you, we're all the same, when you say that you're from Pakistan, you may not appreciate that statement, right? You feel that it might be conflating everything and denying your self-identity. Similarly, I think if you meet a Shia, they might feel the same way. So I get it that there's a certain purpose as far as unity is concerned, and that's okay to say it in that way, but we should also be cognizant of letting the other define themselves. The other point to keep in mind is that we tend to consider only non-Sunni groups as quote unquote sects or isms. I try to avoid this. I think it's just a historical, it's an incidental occurrence of history that Sunnism or Sunni Islam became dominant and Shia Islam became the minority. So because of that, I call both Sunnism and Shiism. If I'm going to avoid an ism, then I would try to do it for both. I also propose we should shift from unity through uniformity of thought and practice to unity through acknowledging diversity of thought and practice, especially in this modern period. It's kind of this Enlightenment kind of thinking that we should all be think along the same exact lines. I think that's a recipe for failure. I think we have to acknowledge that people are going to have wide differences of opinion and become more latitudinarian in our way of approaching things. So these are some of the ideas that I have about talking about something as sensitive as the Sunni-Shia divide. So for some disambiguation, it should be made clear that there are three major extant groups of Shias. So historically, there have been many groups, but the three main ones today are the quote 12ers, which are the Ithna Asharis, the Ismailis, and the Zaydis. I had initially planned, as always, I was more trying to be ambitious than I realized was possible. I wanted to discuss all three today, but once I started making the materials, I realized that's just not possible, and it would probably shortchange all three if I did that. So in this lecture, we will only be speaking of 12ers. Many of these things, which is the dominant group today, it wasn't always historically the dominant group, but that is the case today. And so I will be speaking primarily of them. Many of the things do apply to the other two groups, but we're gonna try to discuss those other two groups on another day. So with that, let's get started. Part 1, Imama. I'm gonna start with a question. Is the Sunni Shia difference only about politics? Well, I'm gonna answer that question shortly, but let's review some slides from the last few lectures. We agreed that after the death of the Prophet in 632 CE, there was a sudden vacuum in socio-political, religious, and spiritual authority. And Muslim groups of virtually all sects sought to replace and extend prophetic authority in these various aspects. As far as Sunni Islam, the caliphs initially claimed all three, but then were limited to taking political authority. The ulama, or the religious establishment, took religious authority, and the Sufis, or the mystics, took spiritual and charismatic authority. And we saw that in last class. Recall as well that we saw how the Sunni caliphs, the ulama, and the Sufi mystics all claimed to be, quote, heirs of the Prophet. The caliphs claimed to be in a position just below that of the prophets, the only difference being that they did not receive divine revelation. The Sufi mystics similarly claim to be just below that of the prophets, the only difference being that they receive ilham, divine inspiration, instead of wahi, divine revelation. They are considered saints, so there's the concept of walaya or wilaya, and they are protected from sins. They can perform wonders, karamat, are granted the right of intercession, and can attain ultimate truths through mystical unveiling and union with God. Historically, many of the Sunni ulama were also Sufi mystics, and many or most of them believed in all of the above in regard to Sufis to some degree or the other. I'm saying all of this so that we can contextualize Shia beliefs. That's kind of what I've been setting this all up for in the first place. I think if I had just started with Shiism, some of these beliefs would be, for a Sunni, a modern Sunni, would feel scandalous or blasphemous. But now that we have all of this context, we can see that the Shia beliefs are not going to be so different than the historical Sunni tradition. So let's talk about Shia Islam. So according to Shia belief, the divinely appointed Imam is the one who assumes all three: political, religious, and spiritual authority after the prophets. 12er Shias believe in 12 of these Imams after the Prophet Muhammad, all of whom came from Ahl al-Bayt. So 12er Shias are the main group of Shias that exist today. And I do have a question that I can answer about the Bohras. The Bohras are not a subset of 12ers, they're actually a subset of the Ismaili Shias, which we're not going to discuss today, unfortunately. So let's talk about the institution of Imama. Imama is the central defining doctrine of Shiism. So the difference between Sunnis and Shias is absolutely religious, not just political. Imama is an office analogous to Nubuwah, prophethood, and Risala, messengership. In fact, Imama is considered superior to Nubuwah and Risala, since the Nabi, the prophets, and the Rasul, the messengers, their job is only to warn the people and deliver the message. The Imam's job, on the other hand, is to interpret, execute, and implement the message. So here's a quote from a Shia text. I'll be citing the source below. The station of divine Imama also includes the supervision of society, leadership of the Ummah, and proper administration of the affairs of people for the purpose of reaching the pinnacle of perfection and felicity. The responsibility of a Nabi and Rasul does not go beyond reminding the people and showing them the way. Whenever a Nabi or a Rasul reaches the station of Imama, he has to shoulder a more crucial responsibility. And this entails that he has to implement divine programs and execute the decrees of the sacred religion on the way of establishing a model and prosperous society. And this is the source here. So Imama is superior to prophethood, but the past prophets can themselves also be Imams. Therefore, the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt, that is the prophets, the Imams that came after the Prophet Muhammad, are not considered superior to the Prophet Muhammad because the Prophet was also an Imam. So sometimes Sunni fundamentalists or extremists will accuse the Shias of believing, for example, that Ali, the first Imam, is considered superior to the prophets. This is not the case. It was only a small group of extremist Shias in the past, as they're called, extremist Gullat, that believed such a thing. Some Shias, especially today, also exclude the arch prophets as well, that is Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Why? Again, because these prophets were also Imams. However, it does seem more common to say that the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt are in fact superior to all of the prophets except the Prophet Muhammad. And the reasoning behind that is that not only were they Imams, but they were Imams or executors to the final and perfected religion as sent to Prophet Muhammad. So among other reasons, they are executing the final and perfected message. So I predicted what the next point was going to say. All right, that was my gush that came forth. Okay, so let's talk about divine revelation. Recall, Sufi mystics claimed ilham or divine inspiration, but not wahi, divine revelation. So they claimed divine inspiration, but not divine revelation. They claimed ilham, but not wahi. What is the difference between these two? Well, it's a very technical difference. Imams, on the other hand, are capable of receiving both ilham and wahi. So how do they differ with prophets? The distinction that they make is that they do not receive Sharia or divine law. So they can't implement new rules of Sharia, but they do receive ilham and wahi. They can also communicate directly with the angels, just like the prophets. Therefore, because of this, because of the fact that they receive ilham and wahi, the Imams are the only ones who are qualified to interpret the Quran and Sharia. Now, that leads us to this question about hadiths. We recall from before that Sunnis take the reports of the Prophet's sayings from the Sahaba. Shias, on the other hand, take the reports of the Prophet through Ahl al-Bayt. Ahl al-Bayt, as we will see, is the Prophet's family, and it's select members of the Prophet's family. But they also take hadiths from the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt. And these hadiths, so it's not that the Imams are simply narrating what the Prophet said. No, they're narrating themselves as they're considered infallible. So there are 14 infallibles in 12er Shiism, and they are just, so their statement is also considered nas or scripture alongside anything the Prophet would say. And there are 4 books of Shi'i Hadith, 12er Shi'i Hadith that are most famous. Just like we have the Sunnis have the 6 books, they have 4 books, and these are the collectors of those 4 books. Now, the Shia Imams are also able to do miracles. Recall again that Sufi saints, which are a part of Sunni Islam, can also perform wonders, but they cannot do miracles. So they differentiate between karamat and mu'jizat, which are miracles, so wonders and miracles. However, the difference between these two terms seems to be very minor and technical. The difference that we discussed before was that really they're the same thing, other than a miracle is something that comes with a claim of prophecy. So a wonder doesn't come with that claim. But because the Imams are the walis of Allah, just like the Sufi saints, but they're also claiming a position, that is the imamat, they can perform both wonders and miracles. So they don't have that restriction. And these miracles, they are quite extensive. They can include, in the sources we see, they can control, they have miracles over matters of life and death. They can foresee a person's death, what his status in paradise will be. They can even actively influence this future status. They can heal the sick, save the dying, revive the dead, speak to the angel of death, and actively cause a person's death. They can also make inanimate objects speak, cause trees to bring forth fruit, cover great distances in a short time, even travel beyond the borders of this world, control the jinn who are at their command. They can also obstruct vision and cure blindness, become invisible, and make others see what is usually invisible, turn a human into an animal, and bring out human properties in animals. So you see this kind of, there's always this duality, this mirroring going on. And they also can do the same miracles that are mentioned in the Quran that prophets can do. So they can turn a stick into a snake. They can withstand fire, etc. So the same kind of miracles the Imams are capable of. And this is just one source of narrated about these sort of miracles. So you see it's a lot of text on this slide, but you can see here that reviving the dead, so there's a cow that's brought back to life, that is in the capability of the Imam, as well as restoring eyesight. In addition to this, part of this this miracle ability that they have is they have miraculous knowledge. The Imams are said to know more than angels and prophets, but again, that would exclude the Prophet Muhammad, as we mentioned. They can know matters of the unseen, and there are even some statements that say that nothing is unknown to them, but this might be interpreted differently by different Shias. They do have knowledge of future events, but they restrict all of this and say that their knowledge of the unseen is not an independent knowledge, independent of God. This is how because there are verses of the Quran, as we know, that say that nobody knows the unseen other than God. But again, then there's the question mark in that verse about are certain people included in that based on God's permission. And so they believe that that is the distinction to be made, that their knowing these things is only through God and through God's permission. The Shia Imams, just like we saw the Sufi saints, they have the capability of intercession. So the Imam is considered the means of access, the wasila, by which believers seek and access the blessings of God. Therefore, one can pray to or through the Imam. It is right and proper, even encouraged to do so, as long as one does not believe that the Imam has an independent power outside of God. And this is why you'll often hear the phrase, Ya Ali Madad, which, by the way, is also said by some Sufis. The Imams and their tombs, so their physical selves and their tombs, are sites of barakah or blessing. So that the blessings from God are transmitted through them, again, as we saw with Sufis. Not only this, but the Imam is necessary for salvation. So salvation depends on recognizing and following the Imam of one's time, as much as on affirming the Shahada and fulfilling Islam's religious obligations. The Imam, therefore, in Shia theory, is not only the head of the community, but also the visible proof of the truth of the divine revelation, God's hujjah on earth. Without his presence, the world would not exist for a single moment. The Imam is the spiritual and political leader, and anyone who opposes his rule is considered an enemy of Islam and of God. So there does seem to be this cosmological significance of the Imam. What exactly it means that the world would not exist, I think that's open to interpretation. But it might just be saying that there is always a need and a necessity for there to be an Imam on earth. So there are certain theological justifications that they bring, that Shias raise for having such a belief. They consider it a part of God's grace and justice that he would not leave the people of this earth without a guide to lead them. There must therefore at all times be such a guide to lead the believers and stand as a witness against the rejectors. This is the reason why God sends prophets, and the same reasoning then necessitates that after the end of prophethood, that God should continue based on his grace and justice to send imams to the people. And this must be done by designation. This is according to the Imami Shias. And the Imami Shias, as we see, will include the Ismailis as well as the Twelvers that we're talking about, the Itna Asharis. The Zaydis are not considered Imami Shias. But according to the Imami Shias, that is, the Twelvers and the Ismailis, every Imam must be divinely designated by his predecessor. So every Imam divinely designates his own successor, and the successor always comes from Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the house, the Prophet's family, and according to Twelver Shias, this is through the line of Hussein. Imama is thus a spiritual hereditary institution. And that leads us to part 2, which is this designation, or nas. So I'm going to just give me 1 second here. Okay, let's start part 2 now. Designation. Let's talk about the origins of Shiism. And if I had a flashlight, I would turn off the light and I would use a flashlight right now. Let's see who this real father, oh, yeah, you can't see my next slide. All right, so let's see who the real father of Shiism is.
Today, inshallah ta'ala, you are going to learn who the founding father of Shiism is. Who is the one man who is responsible for the fundamental beliefs of the Shia. Our story starts in Yemen, in the city of Sana'a, where we have a man who is a Jew. He's a Jewish man. His name is Abdullah ibn Saba al-Yahudi. You may be surprised, why is his name Abdullah if he's a Jew? Brothers and sisters, there are Arab Jews, there are Arab Christians and Arab Muslims. And at that time, there was a lot of Arab Christians and Arab Jews in the area of Yemen. So this man, Abdullah ibn Saba al-Yahudi, and he's where our story begins. He was a Jewish man at the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. Uthman radiallahu anhu was the third Khalifa of the Muslims. He was the third greatest man from this ummah, after Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, who was the second greatest man. And before Umar was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. After Umar was Uthman, and after Uthman was Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhum ajma'in. May Allah be pleased with all of them all together. So this man, Abdullah ibn Saba al-Yahudi, he's around in Yemen, in Sana'a, at the time when Uthman radiallahu anhu is leading the Muslims. And he accepts Islam. Now the historians, such as Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, rahimahullah, Imam ibn Kathir, and so on and so forth. In fact, all of the historians of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, as well as the historians of the Shia, as I'll show to you later, inshallah, they all explain, particularly the scholars of Ahl Sunnah, that this man, Abdullah ibn Saba al-Yahudi, he didn't really want to become a Muslim. He actually hated Islam. He actually was what you call a munafiq. You know, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ in the city of Medina, we always hear about the hypocrites, the ones who are in the lowest part of the hellfire. There were people who used to come to the masjid. They prayed. They would say, Assalamu alaikum, grow their beards, trousers above the ankles. They would look like Muslims from the apparent, but inside they were kuffar and they hated Islam. And the only reason they came to Islam was because they wanted to destroy it from the inside, as well as many other reasons, but primarily they wanted the destruction.
All right, so now you feel enlightened. We can stop this whole talk. You know everything that you need about Shiism. All right, so it is a general trend in pious heresiography to attribute elements you don't like to outside foreign influences, often, as we shall see, to a single shadowy and ill-intentioned figure. It is often, by the way, a Jew or a Jewish person. I don't know if you caught that right there. I don't know how many times he mentioned that. On the flip side, one's own creed is usually back projected as a fully articulated doctrine held by the founders of the religion themselves, or the founders of the religion themselves. However, neither possibility is likely. History is much more complex than that. Religious belief systems develop over long periods of time. Additionally, I'd ask you to use the historical critical method to think about the things that this gentleman, this crazed man, was saying. So how likely do you think it is that somebody had the foresight that, okay, I'm going to convert to Islam, then I'm going to infiltrate them, I'm going to create this belief system, and then 1,000 years later, the Shia are going to run, you know, this does not seem very realistic, right? So this is why I think it's important to use the historical critical method. So I did show this video, but I showed it to you to show how non-serious it is. Unfortunately, this is still being taught in some madrasas, maybe not with all of the hand gestures and the kind of expressive, voice, but Western scholars don't generally take these kind of theories seriously. So the question does arise: where does Shiism come from? What are the origins of Shiism? This was kind of a question we had about Sufism. What are the origins of Sufism? I think these are questions that are difficult to answer. I like to speak of beginnings instead of origins. Origins seems to imply that everything comes from an external source. And again, it's what you don't like that comes from an external source. Your own ideas, of course, come from within the divine source only. But in reality, all faith traditions have internal factors at play and external factors at play. Now, we still have to answer the question: was or is the Sunni Shia difference sociopolitical or religio-theological in nature? Well, it was both. And if you remember the principles of religious literacy, I didn't give them to you again because I felt like you might get tired of seeing them. But one of the principles of religious literacy is that religion is always and intimately tied to culture and historical context. So I think the socio-political and the religious and theological were grafted onto each other throughout history. It seems reasonable to me, however, to say that the initial split was political and historically incidental. And again, many of these slides you've seen in the discussion on Sunni Islam, but we need to reiterate some points. So as far as the historical sources, they are very problematic. Sources are heavily partisan, as we saw in the video that we just watched. The general trend has been to take hadiths and historical reports agreed upon by Sunnis and Shias, and then to just use those. This is, however, historically problematic. Let's think about what that gentleman said about the tale of Abdullah ibn Sabah. So it is true that this character is mentioned in certain Shia texts. So he could say then, look, we both agree. This gentleman is in, this figure is in both of our texts, therefore we should accept it. But that is historically problematic using the historical critical method. So I don't think that that's a good enough strategy, but that's really the strategy used in, and I understand why, in polemical debates between Sunnis and Shias, because they're trying to find a shared ground on which to debate on. But as far as an academic historical route, I don't think that's good enough. I think for the most part, all we can do is recount collective historical memories of the early events. There's a great areas of gray areas that we may not be able to know for certain. The upshot of this is perhaps we should disengage our emotions from these discussions and realize, for example, that the Umar ibn al-Khattab of Sunnism is different than the Umar ibn al-Khattab of Shiism, just as the Jesus of Christianity is different than the Jesus of Islam, because we're using different sources and different stories to construct our memories of these figures. So Umar has a great question. Could you please explain why this method is problematic? Well, there's a very good reason for this. Both sides tended not to want to simply reject historical reports. Instead, if they could accept a report, especially if it was narrated by multiple sources, they would want to accept that source as much as possible, so long as it could be explained away. So just because a certain side accepted a report didn't mean that it was actually, actually happened. There was this tendency to want to accept reports, and this is partly because of the hadith paradigm, which is you want to accept as many hadith as possible without using your aql in deciding which hadith to take and which not to take. This is part of the Islamic tradition. It's definitely on the Sunni side, but you also see it on the Shia side as well. And you see it with, for example, with that figure of Abdullah ibn Sabah. There were the Shia sources, the early Shia sources, many of them do affirm his existence, but then they explain it away by saying, oh, he was an extremist Shia who was rejected by other Shias. So if you can explain it away, then it's no problem of accepting that report. Now, After the Prophet, there was this dispute about succession. The Prophet dies in 632 CE. One group takes Abu Bakr, the Prophet's senior companion and father-in-law, as the Prophet's successor, and this becomes the Caliph. Another group considers Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, to be the more rightful heir of the Prophet's authority. And I know you've seen this slide before. We went down the path of Sunni Islam. Now we're going to go down the path of Shia Islam. So let's talk about Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet. Maybe more importantly, he was raised in the Prophet's house from a young age. According to Sunnis, Ali was the fourth rightly guided caliph. So the Sunnis do respect Ali ibn Abi Talib. According to Shias, however, the Prophet Muhammad informally and formally designated Ali as his successor. The formal and explicit designation is said to have occurred at an event in a place called Ghadir Qum in 632 CE after the farewell pilgrimage. The list of sources used to justify this claim is extensive and impressive, often taken from Sunni sources. So you'll see this in polemical debates. They're trying to find a shared space, and Shias can provide a very extensive and impressive list of shared sources that talk about these such events. Now I'm borrowing the next few slides from Professor Khalil Andani to show you how there are these impressive sources and lists that talk about Ali, and in a way that would indicate that perhaps he is the rightful successor to the Prophet. There's a lot of text on this slide, but you can just glance at this. You can see, for example, to gaze upon Ali is an act of worship. I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is its gate. So whoever desires knowledge, let him enter the gate. And these are all, by the way, from Sunni sources. Here's another slide in which you see that there's a verse of the Quran that is said to be about Ahl al-Bayt, which is the Prophet's family, and it is used for the claim that Ali is the divinely appointed Imam from the Ahl al-Bayt. So you have verse 33, and God only wishes to remove from you all impurity, O Ahl al-Bayt, and purify you with a thorough purification. And there's also statements like you see in Martin Ling's biography, this is my brother, my executor, and my successor amongst you, hearken unto him and obey him. And one last slide here, you see that there are certain hadiths or reports. For example, this one, and I had a really great question about the word kitab, which I'm going to answer right now. But here the Prophet is attributed to say that he is leaving behind two things. One is the kitab of God, that is the Quran, and two is Ahl al-Bayt, his family or his progeny. And then you also have the tradition of Ghadir Qum, which is where the Prophet says to a large gathering that he whose Mawla I am, Ali is his Mawla. So, and this is, according to Shia sources, widely transmitted within the Sunni sources. Before I go to the next slide, I did want to explain, I had a question about kitab of God. What does the word kitab mean in the Quran? There is a debate amongst scholars what that means. It seems clear that it probably, and I have translated as book often, probably scripture is a better term. There's a debate about whether or not the Quran has a self-awareness that it's a book as far as a physical book, because clearly a physical book didn't exist at that time. On the other hand, I do think that the Quran, yes, scripture is probably a better translation. However, the Quran seems to be aware and referring to past scriptures that are books and that can be changed by one's hands. So I think it would be too extreme to say that the Quran does not seem to have a book concept at all. And that's a view taken by, I think, Daniel Madigan and even my friend, Professor Andani. We actually have a friendly debate on that issue. But I can see both sides on this issue. I do translate it as book, but you can kind of think of it as scripture. So now the question is, how do we view these sources? Shias, they accept these reports and affirm them as proof of Ali's successorship. Sunnis generally accept these reports, but tend to explain them away. What about the academic view? I think it depends on one's view of the historical sources. Some scholars take a more skeptical approach, others take a more accepting approach towards the traditional sources. It seems, however, that caution and skepticism is in order due to the highly partisan nature of these events and the lack of corroboration in the Quran. Now, we discussed this in the first lecture, how the Quran is the primary scripture of Islam. It's actually the earliest source we have. So even from a historical standpoint, the Quran is a good source to use. Not only do we have manuscript evidence, the Quran also lacks historical anachronisms. This is a view held by Western scholars such as Fred Donner, Patricia Crone, and also by Muslim scholars such as Javed Ahmed Ghamidi and Fazl Rahman, as well as Professor Jerusha Lamptey, as we saw in her book. All of these slides you've seen before, so that's why I'm going through them very quickly. So let's try to use a historical critical method to evaluate these reports. So we have the hadith of the two weighty things. Here it is, as reproduced from Professor Andani's PowerPoint. You have that the Prophet is said to have left behind the Kitab of God and the Ahl al-Bayt. Now the source is kind of strange. It's mentioned as Sahih at-Tirmidhi. It's not Sahih, but I mean, it's the Sunan or the Jami at-Tirmidhi, but it is generally an accepted report. Then we have another variation which says the Quran and the Sunnah, that the Prophet is leaving behind the book of God and the Sunnah of his Prophet. And then we have yet another report that says, I have left among you the book of God. That it's the Quran alone, or the Kitab there. I translate it as book, but you can say scripture. So you have all three of these reports. Now, how do you weigh these three reports? Which do you accept? Which do you reject? Do you reject all of them? Do you accept all of them? Do you accept one of them and not the others? It's also interesting to look at these and see how the first report seems to say that the Prophet is leaving behind the two most important things in the Shia tradition, which is the Quran and the Ahl al-Bayt. In the second one, you have the two most important things that are important in Sunni Islam, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, which is really understood as the Hadith. And then the third is the view of certain early Mu'tazilis and people who are skeptical of the Hadith. And you definitely had this trend. This report basically says only the Quran. So you have the views of these three different groups that are being back projected onto the prophets. Now, before we go into see how I tackle such reports, let's look at something a little bit more neutral, where we don't have that many dogs in the fight. Let's take this idea about music being haram. So this is from a fatwa site. I know it's a very busy slide, so let me actually click on this link so you can actually see. So, and we talked about music last week, so this is a good one to look up. So if you're looking up whether or not music is haram, halal or haram, you see this fatwa, and it says that the evidence of the prohibition, let's make this bigger. Okay, so you see that there's evidence apparently of the prohibition of music in both the Quran and the Sunnah. So let's see what the proof of this prohibition is in the Quran. So verse 31:6 is used as a proof. And of mankind is he who purchases idle talks, parentheses, i.e. music, singing, to mislead men from the path of Allah. So this is used as proof, but how do they do that? They basically then take hadiths and reports from the early companions and the followers, and then say that so-and-so said that idle talks means music. So you have all of these reports. So the interpretation of the Sahaba and the Taba'in, you have Ibn Masud, Ibn Abbas, and basically what they do is they compile all of these early reports and say that all of these people said that idle talk means music. And then they say that based on that, we have all of these reports, so we have to accept this idea that music, that idle talk here means music. So let's take a look now. at what an intra-Quranic approach that I said that I'm going to use, that Patricia Cohn acknowledges, Fred Donner, as well as Muslim academics. Let's put that verse, so this is the verse actually. And among humankind are those who purchase idle discourse to lead astray from the way of God without knowledge, and who take it in mockery. For them there shall be a humiliating punishment. Now, does this verse really, is it really talking about music? Does idle discourse mean music? Well, let's look at where, and this is the intra-Quranic approach, right? We're looking at the Quran. The way that the classical scholars would read the Quran is they would take it verse by verse, and they would take this kind of atomistic approach, as Fazl Rahman said, where they would read that verse and then they would look at the tafsirs. And so you would stop after reading 31:6, you would immediately go to the tafsirs, and then you would see in the tafsirs that Mujahid said that idle discourse means so-and-so, and Ibn Abbas said that it meant so-and-so. And then you would go off on this tangent and look at all of these different sources, and then eventually you'd come back to this verse and come with the conclusion about what this verse means. I think that that's a very problematic way of reading this verse. I think you should use the intra-Quranic approach, which is you read that verse in its context and try to understand what it means. And you also see what similar words meant elsewhere in the Quran. So here we see that verse 25:41 seems to be pretty relevant to this verse. And when they see you, they take you not, that is the prophets, they take you not except in mockery. Is this the one whom God sent as a messenger? And then in another verse, they denied God's signs and mocked them. But you took them in mockery, that is, you took them, the prophets or the believers, in mockery, till it made you forget my remembrance, and you used to laugh at them. So based on all of this, it seems pretty reasonable to say that the idle discourse being mentioned here is some sort of mockery or some sort of making fun of the Quran or the prophetic message or the message as it has been throughout time. That seems to be what it is, not music. It seems weird to say that among humankind are those who purchase music to lead astray from the way of God without knowledge and who take the Quran in mockery. That seems strange and tendentious is what it seems. And so you'll see this word being used about classical interpretations. Often they can seem tendentious because they are using these outside sources before looking at the Quran for its full context. So now, based on that, let's use this method to critically analyze the Sunni view. Remember, I argued in lecture 2 that the two defining features of Sunni Islam are the Hadith and Ijma, that is consensus. Remember, the term Sunni comes from Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, which effectively becomes, I argue in lecture 2 if you want to see why, it becomes the people of Hadith and Ijma. The question is, can these two concepts, which are so critical to Sunni Islam, can they be found clearly and unequivocally in the Quran so that we can establish that these two concepts existed at that time? And by clearly and unequivocally, I simply mean something like the narration that we had, that I'm leaving behind you for you two things. One is Kitab Allah, and the other is the Sunnah of his Prophet. Look how clear and nice it is in that Hadith report. It's perfectly crystal clear. There's no guesswork involved. You don't have to say that this word means this or that. It's very clear. So that's what I'm looking for in the Quran. The question is, do we have it? Well, Imam Shafi'i looked for that and he couldn't find it. And instead he had to use a verse like this, 59:7. So in a debate with somebody where he was trying to raise the status of Hadith to the level of Nas or scripture, he used this verse, 59:7. And it's interesting that this verse continues to be used to this time. So the same arguments that Imam Shafi'i was using back then are used today. So verse 59:7, whatsoever the messenger gives you, take it, and whatsoever he forbids to you, leave it. So this is said to be proof for the hadith. Let's look at the context though. 59:7, that which God has given in spoils to his messenger from the people of the towns is for God and his messenger, and for kinsfolk, orphans, the indigent, and the traveler, that it not come to circulate among your wealthy. Whatsoever the messenger gives you, take it, and whatsoever he forbids to you, leave it. It seems like it's talking about the spoils of war, that they should go to not only God and his messenger, but also to these other disadvantaged groups, and that it shouldn't circulate amongst the wealthy, and that you should be satisfied with whatever the prophet gives you from that. You should be satisfied, and whatever he forbids you from it, you should leave. Now, you can make a convoluted argument that this is referring to the hadith. You could kind of break off that portion in the bold. You could make some sort of argument, but it's an ambiguous verse at best. It's not a clear and unequivocal verse. Based on this absence of these clear and unequivocal statements on this subject, it is a reasonable conclusion by a Western academic, from a Western academic's historical critical side, to say that this was back projected onto the Quran. So the Sunni supporting version, the Quran and the Sunnah of his prophets, seems unlikely. Okay, let's look at the book or the kitab and my Ahl al-Bayt. How does that fare? Let's do a critical analysis of the Shia view. I will contend, can we mute whoever, there's some background. There we go. I will contend, in line with Wilfred Madelung and perhaps Najm Haider, these are two Western scholars. Now, Wilfred Madelung, he published a book called The Succession to Muhammad, which is considered probably the strongest case for the Shia view of history. Some people think it's biased. I think it's a very good book. But I'm arguing in line with him. So it's not somebody who's anti-Shia. It's a very pro-Allied view. I contend in line with him that the strong case for a formal designation by the Prophet Muhammad is difficult to accept, at least from a historical critical perspective. This is the claim I'm going to be making. You may not agree with it, but I'm going to be making this claim, and then you can judge for yourself whether it's convincing to you or not. However, a weaker case of an implicit indication or desire of the Prophet to have someone in his family, such as Ali, succeed him is certainly a possibility. I don't necessarily agree with this possibility, but I can see how this is a very plausible argument to make. So that is kind of my conclusions that I'm showing you. Now I'm going to show you how we get there. And then you can agree or disagree after that, and we can have a flame war and have Fight Club after that. So let's look at this verse. This is called the Verse of Purification. This is the one that was on Professor Andani's PowerPoint. And God only wishes to remove from you all impurity, O Ahl al-Bayt, and purify you with a thorough purification. This verse is said to confer isma, or infallibility, upon the Ahl al-Bayt, understood to be the prophets Ali, Fatima, Hasan, and Hussein. And then their progeny as well. That is Ali and Fatima's progeny. And Hasan and Hussein's, of course. The Prophet is said to have put all of these people under his cloak, and then this verse was revealed. They are thus called the people of the cloak, as well as Ahl al-Bayt. The Prophet's wife is said to have been specifically excluded from this. So according to the report, she was there in the house and she wanted to come under the cloak, but the Prophet said no to her, basically. So why is this important, by the way? Why is this verse important to Shia Islam? The Ahl al-Bayt are considered infallible. Shia hadiths are narrated from the Prophet and their Imams. That is why it is important they be confirmed isma. Just as for Sunnis, the companions must be rectified, ta'dil as-sahaba. And the grounding for this, for Sunnis, is verse 3:110. You are the best community brought forth unto humankind. Now, I did a deep dive video on this concept of ta'dil as-sahaba, and we see that it doesn't seem to be too terribly strong to ground this idea in this verse. So for the Sunni case, see lecture 2, the deep dive video. But this is why for Sunnis, it's important to rectify the Sahaba. And for Shias, it's important to consider their Ahl al-Bayt and Imams to be infallible. This infallibility and this rectification are actually pretty similar. They do the same job. So in context, let's take a look at that verse 33:33. This is the context. This is the entire passage. We see that 33:32 is addressed to the wives of the prophets. You are not like other women. If you are reverent, then be not overly soft in speech, lest one in whose heart is a disease be moved to desire, and speak in an honorable way. Abide in your homes and flaunt not your charms as they did flaunt them in the prior age of Jahiliyyah. Perform the prayer, give the alms, and obey God and his messenger. God only desires to remove defilement from you, O people of the house, and to purify you completely. And remember that which is recited unto you in your homes from among the signs and wisdom of God. So we see that right before and after it, in fact, even within the same verse, it seems to be referring to the wives of the prophets. Now, let's take a look what Madelung says, who is very pro-Allied and is considered in the Western Academy a good source if you want to take the Shia view of history. He says, and I agree with him, it seems quite unlikely, however, that this part of the verse, 33:33, could have been in effect a separate revelation which was later attached to the rest, as these historical reports imply. The clear aim of the verse is to elevate the rank of the wives of the Prophet above all other Muslim women. It is known, and this is Madelung writing, that Muhammad on other occasions addressed his wives individually as Ahl al-Bayt, evidently with the intention of honoring them. Madelung, meanwhile, refers to the birth of various accounts of a legendary character attaching the latter part of the verse to the 5 people of the mantle. Let's see how Ahl al-Bayt is used in the Quran elsewhere. Again, this is part of the methodology that we are using. In 33:33, again, it seems to be about the wives of the prophets. In verse 1173, it refers to the prophet Abraham and his wife. In verse 28:12, it refers to Moses' mother. In Arabic, you refer to somebody's Ahl al-Bayt as basically that person's wives. It's a polite way of saying it. It can refer to the wives that are under your roof. Just like we saw in lecture 2, how the word hadith, the building block of Sunni Islam, has a different meaning in the Quran, it seems to me that the term Ahl al-Bayt, the building block of Shia Islam, seems to have a different meaning. Now, that you could make arguments that you should split it apart, and there's certain grammatical arguments that are made to justify this. But on just a apparent reading, this seems a tendentious interpretation. We can get into this more in the discussion, and I'm sure we will. Let's look at another verse, Ayat at-Tabligh. I'm going to make the case, and then we'll have the question and answer and the discussion section. So just bear with me a little bit. Let's look at Ayat at-Tabligh. This is what Shias call it. Verse 567. We saw this in Professor Andani's PowerPoint as well. This is the verse of the Quran that is said to be revealed about the event of Ghadir Qum, where the Prophet is said to have designated Ali as his successor. This is the formal designation. So, O Messenger, convey that which has been sent down unto you from your Lord. And if you do not, you will not have conveyed his message, and God will protect you from humankind. Surely God guides not a disbelieving people. So it's said that the Prophet was hesitant to designate Ali for fear that the people would reject him and come out against him. And so the Quran, this verse was revealed of the Quran, telling the Prophet that he must convey the message. But if we look at the context of this verse, again, it seems difficult to accept this interpretation if we're looking at the context. If we look at the red verses, it shows how it seems to be about the people of the book who were wanting to ignite a flame for war. They were trying to work corruption on the earth, which is another kind of phrase that the Quran uses for starting war or rebellion. We also see it in verse 570 that they would even not only just reject their messengers, but they would kill them. And then the blue verses talk about the good people of the book. So the Quran kind of uses this weaving back and forth. And by the way, these blue verses are going back to my deep dive video on inclusivist and exclusivist readings of the Quran. We see that the Quran is it has verses that seem to affirm the people of the book in a positive light and then criticize them as well. And it happens in the same kind of passage, because some of them are kind of considered, they're considered upright, and some of them are not. And here you see that the Quran is saying that, observe the Torah and the gospel, etc. So this is just relevant to our other discussion on inclusivist and exclusivist readings of the Quran. As an aside, this verse, so this is from Professor Andani's PowerPoint, that Ali was chosen to reveal Surah At-Tawbah to the people. In my own work on jihad, I found this story to be tendentious and unlikely. And at that time, I was not even clued into that this verse is used to support the Shia view. See the end of my lecture on jihad for that. Lastly, let's look at imama in the Quran. In my view, both Sunnis and Shias are reading their doctrines into the Quran. Like the term Sunnah Hadith, the key concept of Sunni Islam, the term imama, the key concept of Shia Islam, does not seem to be used in the Quran in the same reified way as it appears in later Shia doctrine. Compare, for example, this hadith. There will appear among you 12 imams coming one after another. This is a clear, unequivocal, explicit statement about 12 imams that come after the Prophet. So this is something that I would want to see in the Quran. This is again from Professor Andani's PowerPoint. You do see that the word imam is used in the Quran. Sometimes it's used in a very different sense that seems to have no relation to a doctrine of imama. For example, there are evil imams as well. It seems to be used in a more general sense of just leader. But we can look at verse 2:124, the first one, where it's Abraham is said to become an imam or a leader of mankind. So you could interpret that as a capital I, imam, and say that this is referring to that institution. The question is, though, where do we have a verse like this about the prophets? Why don't we have a verse that says that just like Abraham's descendants are going to be appointed imams for mankind, why don't we have a similar verse about Ahl al-Bayt, that the imams will come from Ahl al-Bayt? This is the kind of clear and unequivocal verse that I would be looking for. Now, I've given you my kind of viewpoint, and I'm trying to come from the same methodology that I use on any topic when it comes to early Islamic history, like I do on jihad, and you can go to my video on jihad for that. What are some potential Shia counter responses? Well, first of all, the reports about these events, the event of the cloak, Ghadir Khum, the two weighty things, are found in Sunni sources. Even they would claim are mass transmitted in them and are therefore accepted by all sides. So there's that argument that we've already seen. And therefore, somewhat ironically, a Shia might be more invested in saving the Sunni sources from historical criticism than a Sunni. Using these sources in impressive, but certainly not certain case, can be built for the designation of Ali as the Prophet's successor. Another view that was used was, and this is an early Shia view, was that there was Tahrif of the Quran. That is, the Quran was tampered with by the Sahaba to hide the Prophet's designation. This was a view up until the mid-4th century. It is now used in polemical debates to kind of bash Shias over the head with. But the reality is that there are Sunni statements in Sunni sources as well that are just as problematic, such as some sheep eating pages of the Quran and then disappearing. So, this shouldn't be used in that kind of polemical sense, but it is a very justifiable argument that maybe that's why Ali and the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt are not mentioned. But I think there is an even stronger response. Shias, especially Imami Shias, believe that the Imam is the interpreter of the Quran. And remember, like Sufis, Shias believe in esoteric meanings of the text, and these esoteric or inner hidden meanings are known only by the Shia Imam. In addition to the Prophet, the Imams are regarded as the sole authorized interpreters of the Quran, and that is due to their particular knowledge of its esoteric meaning, which include the allegorical interpretation of the Quran and mystical knowledge, as well as its exoteric or apparent literal meaning. The Imams, in fact, embody the meaning of the Quran. They are regarded as the hidden meaning and personification of the revealed word. Thus, the Quran is the silent, eminent divine logos, whose application and understanding is dependent on the Imams, who are the active logos or the speaking Quran. So it's actually the Imam who is he's interpreting the Quran and in some way kind of over the Quran because of that. So I think this can be a good reason to believe that there is kind of a standoff here that cannot be resolved. The view of many Sunnis of reading the Quran in a more apparent or exoteric manner is dramatically different than the view of many Shias who appreciate in the Quran hidden and esoteric meanings. This, I think, makes this an irresolvable dispute between Sunnis and Shias. Our starting points are different, and so we reach different conclusions. From an academic historical perspective, one may certainly choose to take a less skeptical approach to the sources and thereby adopt the Shia view. On the other hand, a more skeptical approach, which relies more heavily on the Quran, would find the Shia view difficult to accept, and that is the view that I take. But from a religious standpoint, a Shia believer could understand the Quran through the interpretive lens of the authorized Imam. As such, maybe we can realize the futility of this discussion and leave this topic alone. Finally, before we get to the discussion, I would argue to you that I think both Sunnis and Shias go to a bit of extremes on the issue of the Sahaba. Keep in mind, I am also skeptical of the Sunni portrayal of this early history and the resulting doctrine of Ta'dil as-Sahaba, which is essential to Sunni Islam. The Sunni view of events seems similarly naive. According to the Sunni accounts, Ali, on being informed of Abu Bakr's election, was in such a hurry to offer this pledge of allegiance that he arrived dressed merely in his shirt and had to send for his clothes. So there's this attempt in the Sunni sources to kind of cover up this conflict that's going on about the successorship of the Prophet. This seems difficult to accept. Do we really think, again, use that historical critical method? Do you really think that he would have rushed without his shirt to go to pledge allegiance? That seems like a kind of a flourish that's put in to kind of stress that point. The Sunni view of all the Sahaba being rectified seems difficult to accept. What about the hypocrites, for example? And again, I refer you to my deep dive video on this. On the other hand, the Shia view that all but a handful of Sahaba, somewhere from 3 to 10, became apostates by choosing to support Abu Bakr over Ali, in the presence of a clear designation in front of hundreds of people at Ghadir Qum, seems to me to be very conspiratorial. Finally, let's look at the hadith of the paper and pen. So somebody asked about this earlier. This is a report about when the Prophet was on his deathbed. He was sick and his sickness was becoming worse. So he is reported to have said, "Bring for me paper and I will write for you a statement after which you will not go astray." But Umar said, that's the second caliph, or soon to be second caliph, "The Prophet is seriously ill and we have God's book with us, the Kitab Allah with us, and that is sufficient for us." But the companions of the Prophet deferred about this, and there was a big hue and cry. On that, the Prophet said to them, "Go away and leave me alone. It is not right that you should quarrel in front of me." And that is narrated in Sunni books. It's in Sahih Bukhari, for example. So this is quite an interesting hadith. Let's do some analysis of it. So Shias believe that the Prophet meant to write a testamentary will in favor of Ali's successorship. Sunnis say there is no proof for this claim. Some say that the Prophet wanted to appoint Abu Bakr, and others say that it was a command to, quote, extirpate the infidels of Arabia. Others say we simply don't know. But notice, they accept the report, but try to explain it away. Interesting also in my work on jihad is this idea of extirpating the infidels, which is put in the Prophet's kind of deathbed pronouncements. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, I think we should be very cautious of deathbed pronouncements because this is where orthodoxy or whatever kind of doctrinal view you're taking, where you try to shove your views into the mouth of whoever you need it to be shoved because they didn't express that throughout their life. So now it's always a deathbed kind of pronouncement. I think that is the case when it comes to jihad, that the Quranic discourse did not go along with the classical view, and so they had to put it in the Prophet's statement. So the Quran has all this talk about living with non-Muslims, with Jews and Christians, etc. That didn't seem to jive well with the classical doctrine, and so they had to say that at the Prophet's deathbed, he actually said that there should not be any Jews or Christians in Arabia. So I am skeptical of the report and think it has to do with debates about Hadith and extra Quranic authority. And on this note, I did want to play this video for you.
Studies of religion, of culture, of history, and of intellectual traditions.
So this is a question. Could you please elaborate for our audiences on your chapter in the book, The Story of Pen and Paper and its Interpretation in Muslim Literary and Historical Tradition?
From quite early on, the Shi'is used various what is called historical arguments as well as logical arguments to prove that Ali ibn Abi Talib was the rightful successor to the Prophet. And one of these hadiths and stories that is associated with that is what is termed as the hadith of pen and paper, or the story of pen and paper in the Muslim tradition. However, this story is instrumental not only in Shi'i approaches to the issue, but we have it in many, let's say, biographies of the Prophet and other sources as well. So what I'm trying to do is sort of looking at it with a different angle and using sort of different methodologies. And instead of focusing on the usual question of authenticity of the hadith, the transmission history, etc., what I look at is the themes or the kind of issues and questions that this hadith brings about. And one of the major issues related to the hadith is usually a very common one, which is the issue of succession to the Prophet, and then the whole anti and pro Ali or Abu Bakr stances. What I want to show is that the story has a very different, which is also a very sort of important issue that it deals with, is the question of writing down anything besides the book of God, the Quran, down. So the whole issue of permissibility of writing down the traditions and the sayings of the Prophet in the early period, and then sort of the permissibility of writing down the Quran, and the whole surprise of the audience at the request of the Prophet to say that, bring me something that I could write down something for you. Everybody is surprised at that because they say that, no, we have the book of God. And this is the whole issue, which then led me to write another paper on some remarks on the oral and written tradition in early Islam. So I tried not only to sort of deal with the same issue that usually associated with this story, but actually looked and tried to highlight the other very important, or which is in my opinion a very important issue that this story deals with, which is the permissibility of writing down traditions in the early period of Islam, and how the different authors, Sunni as well as Shi'is, deal with that issue.
So in my view, all three of those hadiths, of the two weighty things, the reports, they reflect these three different viewpoints that are then being back projected. And so we should see these as important for early debates that are going on in the Islamic world. That is how I see them. Now, I wanted to come back to Madelung. He says, he asked a question. Someone asked this last time. or in the first lecture. Why then did Muhammad fail to make proper arrangements for his succession, even though he presumably hoped for a successor from his family, according to Madelung? Any answer must remain speculative, but a simple Islamic explanation would be that in an important decision of this nature, he, the Prophet, expected a Quranic revelation but did not receive one. Non-Muslim historians may be more inclined to speculate that Muhammad hesitated because he was aware of the difficulties a Hashemite succession, that is somebody from the Prophet's family, might face, given the intense rivalry for leadership among the clans of Quraysh and the relative weakness of the Banu Hashim. In the year 631, Muhammad sent Ali as his representative to the Yemen, where his conduct seems to have provoked some criticism. Upon his return, just 3 months before the Prophet's death, Muhammad found it necessary to make a strong public statement in support of his cousin. That's the events, that's what Madelung thinks. And then he says, it was evidently not a suitable occasion to appoint him successor. Muhammad might also have delayed a decision, hoping to live long enough to be able to appoint one of his grandsons. His death was generally unexpected among his followers, even during his mortal illness. He himself may also have been unaware of the approaching end until it was too late. So the last two lines, the last two sentences reflect my viewpoint that why did the Prophet not appoint a successor? That I think the most plausible, it's speculative, but I think the most plausible reason, again, what do the Sunnis say? The Sunnis say that the Prophet did intend Abu Bakr to be the caliph, and therefore he appointed him the prayer leader, the Imam of the prayer, and that was a hint and nod, and that he wanted the Sunnis to use shura, mutual consultation, to select their caliph. But if that was the case, and they even say, by the way, that that's why all of the Prophet's male progeny were killed, were died, because God did not want them to be a hereditary successorship. But then you got to ask yourself two questions. Number one is, why didn't the Quran simply say that after the Prophet dies, use shura to select your leader, right? If that was really the intent, then why didn't it just say that? And number two is, why didn't, if that was the reason why God killed the male progeny, then why not, what about the Prophet's grandsons? So it seems if that was the reason, then the grandsons should also have died early. So these two kind of explanations for me on the historical critical method are difficult to accept. I do, though, think that, and similarly, on the Shia perspective, I would want to see that explicit designation in the Quran. It seems like there's all these ambiguous verses that are used. Why not just have a clear and explicit verse that would kind of end the matter, especially since it seems like the Prophet is intent on making it explicit if we take that narrative. Also, I think that the Quran itself seems to say that the Prophet or the Messenger could have died, and this verse 3:144 is talking about if the Prophet was killed, and this was before any testamentary will or any designation was ever given. This was supposedly in the Battle of Uhud that this was this verse came. So I don't think it's necessary that we think now, well, how could the Prophet not have left a will? As a physician, I can say we meet people all the time who don't make wills. And then when they get sick so rapidly, and people are not, their close family members don't want to ask them about the will at that time. So I think that based on just our understanding of the human condition today, I think we can say that that's probably a good reason why no successor is mentioned in the Quran. Now, here's Madelung's argument for why he believes that an implicit designation for Ali is probable. So he says, he basically argues that the Quran expresses the thoughts of Muhammad, and based on that, it is evident that he, the Prophet, would not have considered Abu Bakr his natural successor or would have been pleased by his succession. And the reason why is the Quran talks in many different places about how the Prophet's prayed for that their successors would be from their own progeny. And so this idea, so many Sunnis would like to portray it that, that's completely against, justice, that why should it be in one person's family? Well, the Quran itself seems to say that prophethood has gone through certain lineages. And based on that, it seems reasonable to conclude, Madelung argues, that the last of the prophets, Muhammad, would also expect the same to be done for himself. Now, this is a view also expressed by Professor Najam Haider in his introduction to Shiism. He says, even if the Prophet did not formally designate Ali, the proof for his right to succession is embedded in Quranic narratives about past prophets and their clear parallels with Muhammad and his family. The upshot of this view, and this is my own take on it, is the view of an informal designation could be defended in the academic setting, and the formal designation, the Nas, could be relegated to a matter of unfalsifiable religious belief. Now, here is Professor Andani's slide again, where we're seeing that there are many verses in which the past prophets are asking that their progeny be made the successors and prophets after them. So that could be a strong argument to say that perhaps the prophet also wanted the same for himself. And this is different Shia scholars saying the same. And here is a slide that Professor Andani has made, where we see that according to the Quranic conception, prophethood goes through this kind of lineage, this familial lineage. So it's not strange at all, he argues, that such a thing would happen after the prophets. My take. Even though I find this a possible argument, and I do like it based on its Quranicity, I still take a different reading. First, I think we should be cautious of taking this ancestral tree too literally or historically. If you look at it, it says that Adam was born in 4000 BC. Was the first human really being born 6,000 years ago? Second, as I argued in lecture 1, I think the Quran is actually doing the opposite. It is downplaying nasab, or lineage, by arguing that we all come from the same soul, that is, the same father and mother, Adam and Eve. We all descend from Noah and even Abraham, who are portrayed as primordial or progenitor monotheists. This, in my opinion, as I argued in lecture 1, is meant to recalibrate the Arab pagans to align them with the Jewish, Christian, biblical line of prophets, and to argue for a less sectarian view of religion with Jews and Christians. Again, those are the verses that are asking if Abraham was a Jew or a Christian. In other words, I see in these verses universalism and not the prioritization of one lineage over another. The prophets are a one big happy family because this reflects the unity of humankind. More to the point, if the Prophet and the Quran really did mention these stories to emphasize that the leadership should stay within one specific lineage, why didn't it simply say that, or have in it the Prophet Muhammad himself pray for his offspring to succeed him as Abraham does? Why not simply say that the Prophet's offspring are so blessed with prophecy or imamat? Overall, I think Madelung's reading is certainly possible. It is, after all, difficult to say who the Prophet might or might not have been pleased with. But I do not find his reading personally convincing. Even so, it is, in my mind, perfectly reasonable to take the view that Ali was better suited to be caliph than Abu Bakr. This indeed is the belief that Zaydi Shias will hold. I don't take it myself, but I think it's a plausible interpretation. And that is the end of my take. And now we shall break for questions and debate and fight club. So let me just take a look at these questions. All right, first question that I see here is by Maz. The question is, wasn't the Prophet illiterate? In response to the paper and pen hadith. So there is a big debate about what the Prophet is called ummi. There is a debate even amongst Western scholars whether he was really illiterate or not. It seems, the evidence seems to weigh against being completely illiterate in the way we think. So the Prophet, I think, I don't think that that would be a strong enough argument to kind of throw that hadith away just based upon that alone. But that's just my take. All right, let's see. Also, I wanted to thank our Facebook Live and YouTube audiences. We're taking questions from them as well. I'll take one more text question, and then we will go to the video questions. Okay, so from Muhammad Mohsen, if you think that at the weakest level, that weak case basically, that the Prophet would call for Ali to succeed him, would it not contradict the Quran, which said in a verse that you should consult your affairs between yourselves? Like I said, I would want to see a clear verse, an unequivocal clear verse that after the Prophet dies, this is how you go about arbitrating yourself about who should succeed yourself. That would have prevented any of this debate from happening. So that's the kind of like level of proof that I would need to be convinced by that. Yeah. All right, let's take questions now. So anybody, you can use the raise hand feature if you have a question, a verbal question that you'd like to ask. All right, in the absence of that, I will see your next question, then we'll take a break. All right. If we remove all of the political elements from Shia tradition, then do we have something familiar to Sufi tradition? That's a difficult question to answer. I would say that there are definitely similarities between Sufism and Shiism. And Sufism is definitely, like I argued, I think it's a part of Sunni tradition. So I do see that there are these points of agreement between the two faith traditions. I mean, they're not completely separate faith traditions, right? So I do think that there are these similarities and points of agreement, even the kind of reverence for Ali ibn Abi Talib. So we see that amongst Shias, and we see that amongst Sufis as well. So the tariqas, almost all of them other than the Naqshbandis, go back to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And that's kind of that spiritual or charismatic authority that they're kind of grounding in him. All right, so let's see any other, okay. So we got another question about the Shura. So I already answered that one. So the question is from Abid, Mr. Abid Nasim. What if God prefers democracy? Let's say it is morally superior. In that case, choice of successor should be left to people, no? So what I would answer is this. I would say it's perfectly reasonable to have the viewpoint that democracy is something that we should call for, that we should believe in. And we could say even that the Quranic ethos is consistent with democracy. You could make that argument. But I wouldn't want to back project that all the way onto the Quran or the prophets. Clearly, democracy did not exist at that time. So from a historical critical perspective, I think that's difficult to do. I think it's asking too much of the Quran to do that. Let's see. Okay, Chaplain Muhammad, please go ahead. You can unmute your mic.
So my question, I'm not, obviously from where I stand, I don't feel like the Quran answers either one of these perspectives clearly, just as you see it. But my question historically is about what actually did happen. There's a state, and one of the narrations mentioned in there about how Ali rushed to go and give the allegiance. There are also many competing evidences of him actually dissenting for a good amount of time. So I wonder, one, why did you not include those? And two, the notion of shura and sort of consultation. And so I have this question of like, is what actually happened even resemble a sort of broad sort of agreement and consultation where everyone came to this agreement? Or was it something that was a small group of people decided and everyone else was sort of made to accept, follow, or talked into it or forced into it or whatever it is? So it's about what historically, what actually you see happening.
Thank you so much, Imam Muhammad, for the question. So here's what I would say. So I think I would break that down into kind of 3 points / questions. Number one is, As far as the historical sources, I think we have to be cautious and skeptical with them. But as far as what you said initially, I actually take the reports of Ali's dissenting for a prolonged period of time. I actually take those as more realistic and probable than the Sunni sources that seem to gloss over that. And the reason is we could use the historical critical method to see which we think is more likely and what kind of goes against orthodox doctrine, what is kind of the uncomfortable fact. That is, those kind of reports are less likely to be forged. So it is a complex process that you would have to use, but personally, I would find the reports of Ali holding out and even resisting at certain times to be more reliable than the ones that show Ali suddenly seeing the light and then pledging his fealty to the caliph, which I think is more of an orthodox doctrine that they're trying, but you could take that from a religious theological perspective based on your view of the Sahaba. If you took the Sunni view of Ta'dil as-Sahaba, I think you would be inclined toward that view. But again, there is some vagueness here. There's some gray area. We don't know for certain. But that's how I would look. So I didn't include them in the report in this keynote, probably just because I take those for granted. But maybe I shouldn't have assumed that because I think many of us out there would not. So I actually do think that there was quite a lot of conflict between Banu Hashim and Banu Umayyah, and that is reflected. I do think that Ali ibn Abi Talib did think that the leadership should rest in the house of the prophets. And then you had can you remind me what your second question, your third or last question was?
My question, can you?
I don't know if that on your or along
No,
that.
So my other part was about, in terms of what did take place, the degree to which one could establish that this was actually a broad agreement among companions.
Right.
Or
Okay.
not.
Thank you for reminding me of that. So, and that's a good point to raise, that even you take any Sunni narrative, it's not democracy. It's not a parliamentary democracy. There was only a handful of Sunni companions. And I do take those reports pretty, I think that they are realistic and reliable. It was obviously just a handful of people. This is consistent with the pre-Islamic, and that's another reason why I take it as reasonable, is it's consistent with the pre-Islamic tradition. It was, we can say, quasi-democratic, but not in the sense that basically the leading people of that tribe would make that decision. But this would just be a handful of people. So it is different than one person appointing their son, or one person appointing, like how Abu Bakr appointed Umar. But even in that case, there was this concept that's obviously there, it's coming from the pre-Islamic time, that you needed to get the chief people, multiple people, to approve of your designation. So we'll see that not only after Umar is appointed does he need that approval, that enough people pledge bayah to give his claim legitimacy. Similarly, we see even Muawiyah, he does that when he declares himself, and so does Yazid. That even though it's just a show that they do, but they do need to claim that. So yes, one person designated me, but then the community approved me. And the community is not everyone in the community. It's just a small subset of people, which is in the direction of a quasi-democratic institution, right? Because you're spreading out power, but clearly it's not a modern direct democracy as we think of it today. All right, Mr. Raza Ali, please go ahead. Can you unmute your mic? Oh,
yeah, assalamu alaikum.
Islam, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying your the course that you're doing. So just a quick question on this hadith of pen and paper. I mean, if I just kind of logically think about it, there are two possibilities I see over there. One is that the Prophet can read and write, and when he asks for the paper, then he was going to write something by himself. But if he was, so proficient, then I would assume that he would be the best person to have written down the Quran himself and handed it over to the people, so that that would have been the best copy of Quran. And the other possibility is that, let's say he was not going to write it himself, he was going to spell it out, and somebody else was going to write it down. In either case, the witnesses to what has been written down would have been the people in the room at that time. So why didn't he just say it to those people, and they became the witness of whatever that final will and testament was, and that would have been our answer, rather than drag it out so much in that as it is in that story. So that was my question.
Thank you so much. I think that's, I'm glad that you're thinking this out. I may not agree with all of it, but I see where you're going with what you're saying. And I think these things are difficult to tease out. And basically, what I try to call for is consistency. That when you take a source, you're consistent in how you approach it. So whether it's supporting or disproving your, kind of what you consider orthodox doctrine, you kind of be consistent with it. And so, for example, if you're taking one approach with Abdullah ibn Saba, then you should approach that same thing with a hadith that goes in the opposite direction. So you shouldn't be kind of whatever is convenient for you, you affirm, and whatever. And that's really what we tend to do in polemical debates. But on that point, though, I do want to say that even though I'm trying as much as possible to approach this as an academic historian, I cannot deny the fact that it is very possible and probable, and I would be fool not to think it, that my Sunni background, growing up Sunni, does have an effect on how I view texts, even if I try to trying to push back on that. So it's perfectly possible, and that's why many of my colleagues in the academy who come from Shia backgrounds, even though they're also trying to approach the text from a historical critical method, they might see different arguments, and that's just unavoidable, I think. All right, so we're going to take one last question, I think, the written question, because I don't see any more hands up, and then we'll go for the break, because we do have to finish part 2. Would it be safe to say that, notwithstanding the community commonality of fundamentals of Islam, major parts of Shia beliefs are based more on historical incidents rather than divine decree? And I see Imam Muhammad's response. And I would agree with Imam Muhammad's response that I think that's fair to say about all religious groups. Like I said, all religious groups have their internal and external factors. So I don't think Sunni Islam or Shia Islam. I think what I'm trying to push back against in this course, whether I succeed or not, I don't know. I'm trying to stay away from the saved sect mentality that kind of views history as like there was this one sect that had it all right, and then all these deviant sects came and they kept getting slapped down, and now they survive to this day. That's what I'm trying to push back against, whether I'm successful or not. Allahu alam. So let's take a 7-minute break, and we'll be back for part 2, which is a lot less controversial. I didn't even really want to do this controversial bit, but I got so many questions on it that kind of forced my hand. But all right, I'll see you in 7 minutes then. Okay, so thank you everyone for having that very cordial conversation. It went much better than I thought. I thought we would have a slugfest, which kind of would have been funner, but I guess we're all too decent folks for that. So, one last point I wanted to make before I move on is that the way I look at the history is I try to say, how do people today respond to events? And then try to put myself in their shoes and see what's probable and what's not. And that's part of the historical critical method. So, okay, now let's get into the real stuff. That stuff is just not important in my opinion, compared to how do people actually practice their faith? How do they actually, engage in pious acts? I think that's a much better question. So in part 3, we're gonna talk about Karbala. And this is not a class on Islamic history, by the way. I was really kind of forced to do the last section. I wish I could have just skipped it. But we're not going to go into all of the history of the early caliphs and the conflicts and all of that stuff. But Karbala is important to go over because this will play a very important part in Shia piety. So we saw this this schema before. On the left-hand side, we see the Sunni caliphs. I just wanted to remind everybody again. So the first 3 caliphs are kind of undisputed in Sunni tradition, and they were actually in power, and undisputed power. That was Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. Ali is definitely now considered part of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. It's interesting to note, though, in the historical sources, that initially it was actually just two that were definitely considered rightly guided. That was Abu Bakr and Umar. Then eventually Uthman was included in that. And it took some time before Ali was included in the rightly guided caliphs. And there's all sorts of interesting literature on that, how there was definitely some anti-Ali sentiment in the early sources as well. But eventually he is canonized in the four rightly guided caliphs. Hasan is, in this schema, included as the fifth rightly guided caliph, but usually he's not included in the fifth as the fifth one because his caliphate was kind of disputed. Muawiyah was disputing it, so Hasan is kind of ignored. And then you see Muawiyah, and after that is the Umayyad caliphate. That goes on for some time, and then the Abbasids. So that's the Sunni side, just to remind you, because now we're going to be talking about the Shia side. So on the Shia side, you see that after the Prophet, the successor is the first Imam, which is Ali, and then his son Hasan, and then his other son Hussein, and then you have the other Imams after that. We're going to look at another diagram, and then we'll see what the differences are. Oh, I'm sorry, grandson of the Prophet, exactly. So let's look at this this other tree here. So you see that, let me see if I can use my mouse here. Everything disappears. Okay. All right, let's try maximizing this. All right, because this can get kind of confusing, hard for people to remember, especially if you're coming from a Sunni background. So here's Ali and Fatima. Fatima is the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and Ali is his cousin. And so Ali and Fatima are married, and then they have Hasan and Hussein, as well as two sisters. And then, so Hasan is considered the second Imam. And then after Hasan dies, the Imamat passes to Hussein. From Hussein, then Imam Hussein is then killed in the Battle of Karbala, which we're going to talk about. And his son survives the Battle of Karbala, which is really a tragic affair, as we'll see. And then after that, the rest of the 12 Imams on that line, but there is a difference that's going to come between, so the Zaydis will split off. The Zaydis will say that the Imamat then becomes the shared legacy of both the Hassanid and the Husseinid lines. So this is where so all Shias kind of agree on this, but then the difference of opinion will come later. Okay. All right, let's look at the story of Karbala. I did want to, I don't think I would do justice of it by just doing like bullet points. That didn't seem right to me to do that. So I do want to
just 48 years after the death
show this, sorry, this clip, which I will only speed up a little bit. Okay.
Just 48 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, his grandson Hussein is killed in the Battle of Karbala. Why did this battle happen? And why is it so important to Islamic history? After the fourth Caliph Ali was assassinated in 661, a power vacuum emerged, leading to Muawiyah assuming role as Caliph, despite opposition from part of the Ummah who wanted Hasan, son of Ali, who was the grandson of the Prophet, as the Caliph. To avoid further bloodshed after years of conflict, Hasan signed a peace treaty with Muawiyah. This treaty stipulated that Muawiyah would not appoint a successor after him. In the year 670, Hasan was assassinated, leaving his brother Hussein to take on his duties. The treaty was breached when Muawiyah named his son Yazid his successor in 680, beginning the Umayyad dynasty. Yazid spread his power through corruption, bribery, and the use of violence. To legitimize his rule, Yazid demanded allegiance from Hussein. Hussein refused, as Yazid was openly corrupt and known to be brutal. Hussein was forced to flee Medina under threat of imprisonment and assassination. He had received thousands of letters from Kufa, Iraq, pledging support for an uprising against Yazid. Of his refusal to pay allegiance, he said, "I am ready to fight for the sole goal of seeking the reform of the Ummah of my grandfather, the Prophet of Allah. I want to enjoin good and forbid evil." Hussein first went to Mecca for Hajj, but then left to avoid violence and preserve the sanctity of the holy city. Hussein departed with his family and companions to Kufa.
In response to the threat of rebellion from the Kufans, Yazid dispatched the governor to Kufa to quash dissent. This led to thousands of Kufans withdrawing their support on the threat of violence. As they approached Kufa, Hussein's caravan was intercepted by a battalion of Yazid's army, led by a man named Hur al-Riyahi. A greater army, which numbered in the thousands, led by Omar bin Sa'ad, joined him and surrounded Hussein's camp in what is now known as Karbala in modern-day Iraq. The army cut off access to water for Hussein and his family, leaving the men, women and children to suffer from days of thirst in Iraq's blistering desert heat. The army demanded allegiance from Hussein, threatening him with death. Despite all the odds, Hussein refused to back down. On the night before the battle, Hussein told his companions that they were free to leave, but they pledged to stand beside him in the face of certain defeat. The following morning, on the 10th of Muharram, known as the day of Ashura, Hussein delivered a powerful speech, reminding the opposition that he was still the grandson of the Prophet and that he still wished to leave. Moved by Hussein's speech, Hur abandoned Ibn Sa'ad's army and joined Hussein's. The battle commenced, with Hussein's 70-odd companions facing off against an army of what many historians number to be 30,000. The companions of Hussein fought group by group and were martyred on the battlefield. Eventually, Hussein was left with a handful of remaining family members. They too were killed. Hussein, now with no one beside him, pleaded with the enemy forces for water for his 6-month-old baby. The enemy responded by firing a fatal arrow at the infant, killing Hussein's child in his arms. Hussein buried the child and bid farewell to the women and children of his camp. He fiercely charged into the battlefield, where, after fighting valiantly, eventually fell from his horse and was surrounded by the enemy soldiers. The grandson of the Prophet was brutally attacked from all sides and beheaded. The enemy forces attacked and plundered the possession of the dead bodies, as well as the camp of Hussein's family. The tents were set ablaze with the women inside, which included granddaughters of the Holy Prophet. The family were taken captive by Yazid's army, later to be paraded to Damascus in Syria. The story of Karbala shook the Muslim Ummah as news spread, launching several uprisings across the Muslim empire. Many argue that the Battle of Karbala forever changed the course of Islamic history. The day of Ashura is mourned globally by millions of Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, to honor the heroic stand of the Prophet's grandson, Hussein.
All right, it's a little hard to speak after watching that, yeah, so now obviously, I mean, you know I'm going to say it, there are obviously some legendary aspects to this story. It does take on a legendary aspect to it. There's a cosmological aspect to it. You see like heavenly figures there. But I do think that we can take the general story as reliable, and it's quite shocking if you think about it, that it really hits you that this is the Prophet's grandson. Think about somebody's grandson that you love, and let's say you are competing for some position or something. Can you imagine like going to this extent? I think this is, and as a Sunni, I don't think I quite appreciated this, but it really hits you when you think about that, I think. So this is going to have a profound effect on Shia piety. So we all know about Muharram. It's the first month of the Islamic calendar. It is a month of mourning for the Shia Muslims. It culminates in Yom Ashura. And this is characterized by storytelling, weeping, reenactments of the battle, and for some Shias, self-flagellation, which is controversial. Not all Shias do it. And like I said, when the principles of religious literacy, things change over time. So it's unfair to characterize a people by one set of people in one area. And first of all, self-flagellation in all its forms is not necessarily something that we should say is completely unacceptable. Maybe it's not acceptable from a Sunni practice, but This is a way of increasing one's love and affection for the Prophet's grandson and for making it real, like a reality in your life. So you're living Ashura every day, or in this day, you're reenacting it and bringing it to a reality. So this is a key concept in Shia Islam. That's why I labeled this talk with this, love for Ahl al-Bayt. The Shias do ground this in this verse of the Quran, 42:23. Say, O Muhammad, I ask not of you any reward for it, save affection amongst kinsfolk. Sunnis take a different interpretation of this, that the Prophet is asking his kinsfolk, that is the Quraysh, to be merciful with him. But in any case, a key concept within Shia Islam is love for Ahl al-Bayt, which is understood to be the Prophets, Fatima, Ali, Hasan, Hussein, Ali Zain al-Abidin, and the remainder of the Imams. So 14 people in total. The Shias keep the memories of these individuals alive through recounting their stories, consecrated images, pilgrimages to their tombs, passion plays, etc. Love for Ahl al-Bayt is one of their 10 ancillary, the Furu ad-Din, the principles of religion, along with the Shahada, prayer, fasting, alms, khums, jihad, enjoying the good, not enjoying the good, sorry. It was very late when I was finishing this. Enjoying the good, forbidding evil, and disassociating from the enemies of Ahl al-Bayt. Of course, this last element can be a bit controversial, but the point here is, I would say that Sunni, and we're going to look at Sunni conceptions of love for Ahl al-Bayt, it is definitely different. But I gotta say, I have to admit, if the fire that burns in Shia Islam for the love of the Ahl al-Bayt, it's definitely stronger, especially as we move into the modern period. I think, and we're going to talk about modern Sunni Islam, which takes, and I don't put any value judgment on this, but there is this kind of Protestantization of Sunni Islam, and there's a move away from even so. And I do get in friendly debates with, again, my colleague Professor Andani. We debate about maximalist and minimalist interpretations of the prophetic role. I do take a kind of more on the minimalist side of the prophetic role, and he takes more of a maximalist approach. But I think what that does is, for the Shias, the Imams are a living representation of Ahl al-Bayt, and that keeps that memory alive. And then you have these images and these practices, which really keeps that love alive and burning. So I think that's important to recognize. So this is from Najam Haider's book, his introduction. He talks about the key point here, so I'm not going to read all of it since we're running out of time, but it shows that there is a difference of opinion about who the Ahl al-Bayt are. The Zaydis, for example, extend the Ahl al-Bayt to all the descendants of Hasan and Hussein. The Imami, the 12er Shias, limited to those 12. The Ismailis go through their line of Imams, and they do still have a living Imam, by the way. That's for the Ismailis. We're going to talk about them at a later time. And I don't want to ignore the Ismailis, by the way, which unfortunately are pejoratively called Agha Khanis on the Indian subcontinent. I really want to stay away from using pejorative labels for people. We should call people by what they call themselves. We would want that for ourselves. We don't like being called Mohammedans, right? So we don't like, we shouldn't call other people terms that are kind of pejorative. And even with Ahmadis, I use the word Ahmadis. I don't use the word Qadiani. Similarly, that's how I approach things. So we see the Sunni view that's in that bottom paragraph. Sunni scholars do honor the family of the Prophet, but place them on par with other figures from early Islam, namely the entire generation of the Prophet's companions. The Shias, by contrast, revere specific companions, but view the family as the exclusive heirs to the Prophet's authority. And one could say probably that the Sunni view, because they take such an expansive view, maybe that does water it out a little bit, that's possible. But I do see in a day-to-day life, I do think the Shias really exhibit this love for Ahl al-Bayt. Tied to love, so right next to love in Shiism, I see justice. Justice becomes a major principle of Shiism. And think about why that is. You have that event of Karbala, that it's a grave injustice that's being done. So then justice becomes this key concept in Shia Islam. And that's why justice is in the 5 principles, the usul ad-din of Shiism. Just like we have, Sunni Islam talks about the 5 pillars of Islam. For the 5 principles of Shiism, adala, or justice, is right up there. It's number 2, right next to tawheed. And what they meant by justice is that God is just. And they took that in the sense of a Mu'tazili sense. We're going to talk about that, but basically that we have to hold, our conception of God is kind of held to account based on what is just and what is right, as opposed to, we'll see the Sunni view, which takes this kind of wordplay that whatever God does is by definition just. That's a very different conception. We'll get into that. There are, of course, different views amongst Sunnis on this. And then imama, you see, is the other one that's of note here in the 5 principles of Shiism. Now, there is this concept of taqiyya that I wanted to get out there. This is, the English word is dissimilitude, which is like, okay, what is that? But basically, taqiyya in its essence is where you have to hide your profession of faith for fear of persecution, of being tortured or killed. And so it's due to this heavy persecution. Remember, we have Karbala. After that, many of the imams become quietist. And that's due to the fact that the Umayyads were actively killing their imams. There are multiple reports of poisonings of the imams, targeting them and killing them. So the imams had to go into hiding, and them and their followers had to exercise taqiyya. Although this practice is often criticized by Sunnis, I think it should be pointed out that Sunni persecution is what necessitated this practice in the first place. More to the point, Imami Shias became quietists, awaiting the end times to rise up against the illegitimate Sunni caliphs, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, who are seen as tyrannical. All right, part 4, we're going to talk about the later Imams. This, again, is the 3 major groups here of Shias that still exist. You see in the green, you see the Zaydis. We didn't talk about them. Then you have the Imami Shias, which is that kind of, I don't know what you're going to call that, light red. And the Imami Shias can be broken down into the Ismailis to the left and the Itna Asharis, or the 12ers on the right. And that's the group that we talked about, who are now the majority of Shia, but they weren't always. The Ismailis actually outnumbered them for some time of history. And the Ismailis are broken down into these 2 groups, and then the Druze also came off of them. Druze kind of split off. Some of the Druze consider themselves a different religion altogether. But you have the Boras, that's the common term, and then the Agha Khanis, which I don't like using that term, but they are the Nizari Ismailis. So you have the Imami 12ers, you have the Imami Ismailis, which are broken down into the Boras and the Nizaris, the quote-unquote Agha Khanis, and the Zaydis. So this is a schema of a diagram that shows the 12er Imams. So let's look at this. All right. So again, you had Ali and Fatima, then you have Hasan and Hussein. Hasan dies, and then Hussein also he's martyred, and then his son takes over. Then when his son dies, then it passes, the Zaydis split off, and we'll talk about Zaydis later. Then the 5th Imam, after the 5th Imam, then there's Jafar as-Sadiq, who's respected by both Sunnis and Shias. And then basically you have here are the 12ers and here are the Ismailis. They're both under Jafari fiqh. So they're often called Jafaris, which is kind of posited as like the 5th kind of madhab in addition to the Sunni ones that we talked about. That's a legal school, by the way. And this split happens after Jafar as-Sadiq, because what happens is one of the son is designated by the Imam, but the son actually predeceases the Imam. So then there's a dispute about whether to switch to another brother, which is another son, which is Musa. And then some people continue to take Ismail because Ismail had his own son. And so that's where the Ismaili branch, that's the reason for this difference of opinion. So some Shias took that Ismail was the one designated and that he designated his son. And that's the Ismailis, which we're going to talk about in another lecture. The Ismailis, the Agha, as we call them, not you, sorry, but people call them the Agha Khanis. They are a relatively small branch of Shia Islam, but their influence in Islamic history and philosophy is quite profound. So I think it would be wrong to ignore them. Now, as far as the 12er Shias, they go down this line. So these are their 12 Imams. And then basically at the 11th Imam, Hasan al-Askri, there's basically a problem. he dies, and there's a question about whether he has a son or not. It's said that he did have an infant son that then goes into hiding, and that becomes what is known as the minor occultation. So let's read Najm Haidar's account of it. So it says, quote, "The identity of the Imam was a recurring problem for the Twelvers in the century following Ja'far as-Sadiq's succession. Twelver Imams were reluctant to make public statements out of fear of Abbasid persecution. Formal designations of succession, which generally took place when an Imam was approaching death and in the presence of a handful of companions, were difficult to verify. More problems arose when the 8th Imam, Ali al-Ridda, and the 9th Imam left single male heirs who were only 7 years old. Each of these disputed successions spawned groups that claimed that a particular Imam was not dead, but in occultation, ghaiba, waiting for the proper time to return and establish his rule as the qa'im. The imamate of the 11th Imam, Hasan Al-Askri, was particularly troublesome. It was hampered by competing claims of his brother Ja'far, which became especially divisive after Al-Askri's sudden death in 874 with no apparent heir. Soon after Hasan al-Askari's burial, however, his primary financial agent, Uthman, announced the existence of a son named Muhammad who had gone into hiding out of fear of the government. The announcement of the occultation of the 12th Imam plunged the Twelver Shia community into full-blown crisis. The new Imam was an inaccessible infant whose existence could only be verified by a handful of people. This leads to the minor occultation. So Hasan al-Askari died in 874 and was said to have left behind an infant heir, the 12th Imam, who had gone into hiding and would return as the Qa'im and the Mahdi at the end of times. The Imam was, however, said to be in contact with his financial caretakers who collected the khums on his behalf and conveyed his instructions to the community. The succession of, I believe it was 4 caretakers, came to an end, and then the community lost any contact with the Imam whatsoever. This resulted in the major occultation that started in 941 CE and continues to this day. The argument, remember, had always been that there must be a living and one assumes accessible Imam to guide the people. Yet now the Twelver Shias found themselves in a similar condition as the Sunnis. The Shia response to this, or the Twelver Imami response to this, was that there could only be a limited preordained number of Imams, and there was also a necessity for there to be an Imam at all times. This meant that the last Imam had to go into a period of prolonged hiding until the end of times. So you can kind of think of this. There are Sunni thinkers who have said that, and this is a Sunni view, for example, that the reason why we pray 4 rakahs in a certain prayer, there's some Islamic philosophers would say there's no reason why it's 4. It could be 5, it could be 6, it could be 2, but God just chose a number because he had to choose a number. But more traditional Sunnis would say, no, there is a certain wisdom behind why he chose 4. It had to be 4. So I think this is a similar kind of argument being made here, that there had to be, for certain, maybe spiritual reasons, there had to be a certain number, maybe that has certain barakah in it. And that's the reason for it had to be limited to 12. And because that Imam had to last till the end of times, that's why one of them had to go into hiding. Now, once the Imam goes into hiding, all of a sudden, Shia law and theology has to evolve. Think about it. When the Shias had a living Imam in their midst, they did not need to develop a complex system of law and theology. They simply asked the Imam. Think about in the time of the Prophet. There was no concept of fiqh. There was no theology. You just simply went and asked the Prophet and he would answer a question for you. Similarly, when there was the Imam would simply just answer. But once the Prophet dies in the case of Sunnis, they need to develop fiqh and theology. Similarly, Shias now need to do this at a much later time. With the occultation of their Imam, the Twelver Shias needed to develop both of these. Because the Twelvers were many long decades behind Sunnis in terms of law and theology, just for that reason, it is not surprising that they drew inspiration from their Sunni counterparts. So you will see a corollary between Shia theology and, more importantly, in Shia law. Shia law, Jafri law is not very different. It's like the difference between the 4 schools. It's pretty much similar difference. It's not that much more. Now, what's interesting is at the time of the occultation, and this makes a lot of sense, a majority of the Twelver Shias were traditionists, akhbaris, relying exclusively on reports that conveyed the words or actions of the Prophet and the Imams. Okay, so this is another division. I know I'm probably overloading you with information, but the Twelver Shias are divided into akhbaris and usulis. Akhbaris comes from the word akhbar. Remember, we said that according to Shias, they take the hadith of the prophets, but they also take the reports of the Imams. These are called akhbar. Sometimes they're called hadith, but they're often differentiated by being calling akhbars. So the akhbaris are the people who are kind of like we talked about in the Sunni lecture, the Ahl Hadith, who follow the hadith. So similarly, they're akhbaris who are very traditionist, they're text focused, they want to minimize your use of intellect or rationality. So in the early period, it makes sense that these akhbaris were kind of more influential. Why? Because the Imams had just gone into occultation and their rulings still made a lot of sense in that time period. But by the 11th century, the Usulis had started taking over, led by Sheikh al-Mufid. And the Usulis accepted many Mu'tazili ideas. Mu'tazilis, as we recall, we haven't discussed them yet formally, but they were the Islamic rationalists. They were generally Sunnis, but the Usuli Shias, they basically took many Mu'tazili ideas, whereas they rejected others. In fact, the Mu'tazilis and the Shias often were at loggerheads over the issue of imama and infallibility and intercession as well. Now, what the 12ers did was they adopted the Mu'tazili view of meta-ethics, where human reason could determine right from wrong. The Shias also accepted the Mu'tazili view of free will as opposed to predestination. This, I think, has a lot to do with the context. Remember, they're opposed to the Umayyads. The Sunnis take a predestinarian view where everything is by God's will. If you accept the ruling elite, you basically saying, I'm the caliph. What I do, well, God ordained me to do it. God ordained me to be caliph. So that's what basically is going to happen. But if you take a free will point of view, Shias are basically going to take this Mu'tazili view, which is more towards this free will. And I know we have to finish, so I'll just wrap it up real quick. So the Shias do take, accept 4 sources of law. Maybe we can, let's see. How about, I think we'll call it a day and I will finish the rest. I will do law and the modern period in a deep dive. And you can see that on my YouTube. So let's do that. Now, just really quickly, the minor occultation happens and then the major occultation. We talked about that. And then the Safavid Empire, basically the leader converts to 12er Shiism, and we're going to do that in the deep dive in modern period. We'll talk about Khomeini just a little bit. These are finally the books that I wanted to, I'm sorry for going over time. These are some of the books that I recommend. Shia Islam, an Introduction is a pretty good balance between an academic book and a popular book, so I recommend that. The Succession to Muhammad, that's by Matalung. That's a good view if you want to take more pro-ally view of history. I really like this book, Ethics of War and Peace in Iran and Shia Islam, because I actually got many of my ideas about jihad from this, and that's where I see this cross-fertilization is a good thing. We can actually benefit from this cross-fertilization instead of considering Shias as the enemy or the other. If you want to read some primary text source, definitely Ali's speeches, The Path of Eloquence in the bottom right corner. I think that's a great book, very inspirational for you to read. Leslie Hazelton's book, I think somebody mentioned it. Thank you so much for mentioning it. So that's one that I recommend. There is some editorialization there. It is a popular book, but it's a kind of she's a journalist, but I think it's a fun read and a good one. And then those are 2 other books that I recommend there. So just some admin things, and we'll take some questions, and whoever wants to leave can leave. Next class will be on Wednesday, same time, same place, 4 p.m. Central. And we're going to discuss the Islamic rationalists and philosophers. Quite excited about that. Join the class, the Google Classroom. The code is there, THN2ID3. That's what you have to enter it. Upload your video responses and post them on the Google Classroom. I'm sure you have all sorts of ideas, and you may disagree with everything I said. Please put it up there in a respectful way. Let's make that a place for engagement and discussion. Subscribe to my YouTube so that you can get the deep dive video that I'm going to do. And there's my email address. Please give me feedback and input. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, I can take them now. Otherwise, we can break for soon to be iftar. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. So the question, I'm just going to answer one question. Again, you can leave if you need to. This is by Nadim. If Umayyad and Abbasids basically became oppressive kings and emperors, what kind of freedom did the scholars have in this period? How reliable will scholarly works be from that period, in that it wasn't meant to please the caliphs and emperors? So I gotta be honest, I take a less radical view of the Umayyads and Abbasids. I think there was plenty of oppression and tyranny, but I don't cast them as kind of on a cosmological level of being the cosmological evil. I think there was good and bad, and there was certain freedom of expression that definitely existed. We'll see that with the Islamic philosophers and theologians. It came and went, so things were not perfect, things were not rosy, but I don't take that completely polar opposite view either. Okay, and then let's see. All right, I think we will call it a day. Thank you very much, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Oh, Tyler, can you do the 12er Ismaili and Zaydi Shias? We will do that in a future lecture. So I'm sorry about that. I don't want to shortchange, especially the Ismailis, and a little bit we'll go over the Zaydis too. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.